I'm Richard Taylor from the Philosophy Department at Marquette University. Together with my colleague, Professor Andrea Robilio at the Catholic University of Leuven, we present this course on Aquinas on metaphysics. Our focus today is on the commentary on the De Hebdomadibus, Chapter 4. This is video lecture 13a, the first of two. Video lecture 13b will be on Chapter 5 of the commentary on the De Hebdomadibus by Thomas Aquinas. So without further ado, let us proceed. In Chapter 3, Boethius, as we've already seen last week, Boethius set out two unsuccessful efforts at understanding how things could be good insofar as they exist. Just to remind you then, first, they could not be good by participation, because that would mean that they themselves, insofar as they are not good, since they get their goodness only through participation, namely by something added to their essences. The other alternative, though, is not fruitful either. So I go on, but neither could they be good by substance or essence, because that would mean that they are good in virtue of their very own substance. But what is good in virtue of its own substance is a substantial good, as is the first good, which is God. So they would all be God. Quodico nefas est, which is wicked to say. In Chapter 4 now, Boethius suggests a possible solution, a multi-stage solution here. First, it is possible for the mind to conceive as distinct or separate what are in fact not distinct or separate things, such as a triangle, not existing in matter. So we're able to conceive that on the basis of abstracting or extracting the triangle from its material context. So the mind can do such a thing. Second, one then applies that separation or removal to God, or the first good, though it has to be conceded that it's commonly known that God is or exists. So we take that kind of separation, and now let's put that with regard to God. Separate God off, or separate off the first good, and separate it off as something separate, and leave it out of consideration. So we leave God out of consideration here, even though, of course, God can't ultimately be left out of consideration. In this kind of consideration, then, being good and being existent will differ, since things will exist without being good, says Boethius. For things in this case, to be would be other than to be good. Close quote. Things would then exist, but not be good. He continues, and alternatively then, this is my paraphrase of Boethius, alternatively then, were things nothing but good, si nihil aliud essent, nisi bona, they would be the principle of all things, not plurality of things, rerum viderentur esse principium, as the one good, along the lines of what we saw in Chapter 3 via the simplicity argument. Since the posited things, which the simplicity argument was in Chapter 2. In fact, I will change that at the moment here. I'll put it right there. You'll see me change it in the video. Chapter 2. So in Chapter 2 we saw this via the simplicity argument. Since the positive things, which are but are not of themselves good, are in fact good when they're instantiated in the world, in some essential, non-essential way they are good, then they would not be simple because they are composite and would have to receive their goodness from something else. So in reality, we take here in reality that there are things that are in the world are also good. And if it were the case then that they attained that goodness in some other way than in the virtue of the very attainment of being, then they would be certainly composite, and things of the world are composite. He continues then, the simplicity argument then yields that things are not simple but composite, and so their existence must have been willed by what is simple, quote, that which alone is good, close quote. So, given the simplicity argument, and these are not the things that are simple, and there must be something simple, then that thing that is simple must have willed their existence, because things that are composite require some existence outside of themselves. And then, next step, hence, quote, their being has flowed down from the will of the good, close quote. So, quote, they are said to be good. For the first good, because it is good, in this, that it is, close quote. What of these good things that exist in the world? Quote, the second good, however, because it is flowed from it whose being itself is good, is also good. So we have it set up here with Boethius that the causality of goodness in things comes from God, who is good, and in God, goodness and being are together, and so when God creates something, then along with the goodness that it provides, God also, a being that it provides, that God provides, then also the good is provided. Further, the first good, which is such that its very being is good, quote, can rightly be said to be good in this way, that it is. So the first good is good in virtue of its very being. Next, quote, for if they, namely the secondary goods, had not flowed down from the first good, then they would not be good insofar as they are, close quote. So what he's saying is, even on that, given that supposition that we separate the goodness of the good from the being of things, and nevertheless we see things that are good and that exist. And so that goodness and their very existence must have come from God, but and only in this way are they good insofar as they exist. And so as he says here then, for if they, the secondary goods, had not flowed down from the first good, then they would not be good insofar as they are. So they'll be traced back to the first good. So as a result then, the solution is that both being and goodness are together in any existing thing. But this is only because both are received from God. Now, to penetrate a little more deeply in thinking about this, consider this question. What if there were no God, but still things were existing in the world? What would be the status of things then? Does that question in fact make sense? And I suggest that you unpack this question for yourself and think about what this would actually mean if such a thing were possible. Now, in his commentary, Aquinas follows Boethius very closely, and he explains that the mind is able to separate one intelligible structure or ratio from another, even if they don't exist as distinguished or separate in reality. This then is abstraction or separation in thought. Relating this to the Aristotelian doctrine then regarding knowing what is prior in our apprehension or understanding and knowing what is prior in reality, Aquinas proceeds as follows. He says, we know sensible things more readily than their cause, and so we know sensibles, which are the effects of God, more readily than we know God himself. And for this, see Aristotle Physics, Book 1, Chapter 1. Now, the supposition of Boethius is that things are not good in their very being. If that's the case, how then are things good? Is goodness just another transitory accident, such as white, heavy, or round? No, it's not the same. Quote, for the goodness of each thing is understood to be the virtue through which it completes a good operation. For virtue is what makes its possessor good, and renders its work good, as is evident through the philosopher in the book of the Ethics, writes Aquinas. So the completion and fulfillment and the perfection of something is the thing's good. Quote, that these properties are something other than the substance of the thing, he proves through this, says Aquinas. It would follow that each of the aforesaid, if these were the same as the substance of the thing, would all be identical with each other. So if they're all identical with the substance, then they're all identical with each other. Namely, weight would be the same as color, and good, and as white, and as rotundity, because things which are identical with one and the same are identical with each other. So they would all collapse into one. That is, their being would be the same for all these at once, which is not so. Consequently, since it's not so, there must be in these things then a distinction of being and accidents. Quote, then, thus, therefore, if in some way they were not from the first good, and nevertheless in themselves were good, it would follow that in them it would not be the same that they be of some sort and that they be good, but it would be other for them to be and to be good. So if it's not from the first source, then those two would be distinct, but in fact they're not distinct. Now, I want you to ponder again, as I said earlier. I'd like you to ponder this time, though, about how the simplicity argument is at work and what follows. Take some time to think about it. What is the nature of the simplicity argument, and how does it function in the De Hebdommadibus and the commentary in the De Hebdommadibus? That might be an interesting course paper. I certainly would suggest it to you as a consideration. Now, Aquinas goes on then, explaining what he's doing. For that which is the very essence of goodness is the first principle of all things, namely God. As a consequence, it would not need to be said in the plural of all those that they would seem to be the principle of things, but rather in the singular, that it would seem to be the first principle of things, as if all good things were simply one. For one alone is, which is of this sort, that it be only good and nothing else. So there's only one thing that is only good and nothing else, and just one. This, namely that all good things be one, however, is clearly false. And so too, the first consequent, namely that created things, the first good removed, would be nothing other than this which is to be good. That follows on the arguments then. Hence, writes Aquinas, because created things do not possess simplicity in every respect, such that they are one, they are as one the essence of goodness, this is what Boethius put forward, then they must be willed and caused by God, who is, quote, the very essence of goodness, close quote. Now, could God create things in such a way that they exist without them being good? What would that mean? What are the entailments here? Ponder the possibility, then, that we have things that exist without being good. Could God create such a thing? How does one want to address this question? How can you approach the question itself? I'll leave that for discussion in class. More on D2L. I think it would be good, though, to give it some careful consideration. And then I think that consideration would enable us to better understand what Aquinas is doing here. So, things are willed and created by God, who is the first good, as essentially good. And as for the second grade, Aquinas writes, quote, but a second good, which is created, is good inasmuch as it has flowed from the first good, which is good through essence. So things are good insofar as they came from the first good, which is good through essence. Therefore, since the very being of all things has flowed from the first good, it follows then that the very being of created things is good, and that each created thing is good inasmuch as it is. but only in this way, writes Aquinas, that created things would not be good insofar as they are if their being did not proceed from the highest good. Close quote. So it's in virtue of their being proceeding from the highest good that things in the world are good. And so then Aquinas concludes as follows, quote, his, namely Boethius' solution comes back to this, therefore, that the being of the first is good according to its own intelligible structure, or ratio. Why? Because the nature and essence of the first good is nothing other than goodness. Hence, the simplicity argument. Then they're all one. These collapse into one. The being of a secondary good is good indeed, but not according to the intelligible structure of its own essence. Why? Because its essence is not goodness itself, but is either humanity or something else of this sort. But its own being possesses this, that it is good owing to a relation to the first good, which is its cause, namely God, to which it's related as to a first principle and last end. Now, regarding created things, Aquinas then speaks of a twofold goodness in created things. One, inasmuch as they are termed good through a relation to the first good. You had that already. In this way, or according to this, both their being and whatever is in them from the first good is all good, because it comes from the first good. The other goodness is considered in them absolutely, inasmuch as, namely, as each one is termed good insofar as it is complete in being itself and in operating, with that second sense of good. And this completion does not belong to created goods according to their essential to be itself. Right? Otherwise, if good belonged to them, then they would all be essentially good, and we would collapse into God. But rather, it belongs according to something superadded called their virtue, as was stated above. And according to this, their being itself is not good, whereas the first of them has every sort of completion in its own being itself, and therefore his being is good, both according to itself and absolutely. So that's the reasoning of Aquinas in chapter 4, and I just wanted to go over the text very carefully with you on this, but this is the argument of Aquinas in establishing that there is a first good. But take a look again at the questions that I raised, and perhaps we can discuss those during the class session. Those confronting those questions will help very considerably for the clarification of exactly what Aquinas is doing. I think what he's doing is rather subtle, and those questions will enable us to push a bit to see, in fact, what he's really after. And I'll stop here. This is 13A. 13B is upcoming.